one of the ways in which economic or neoliberal globalism is justified in the name of free trade. That's, of course, a great fiction. The New York Times is hardly a progressive or radical rag, but not too long ago, they had an editorial about the fact that it is very rigged. For example, the reason that the World Trade Conference in Cancun broke down in September is that the developed countries would not agree to stop subsidizing to the tune of billions of dollars agribusinesses, huge agribusinesses in this country, which make it impossible for farmers in developing countries to compete on the world market. So this is a profoundly hypocritical claim that this is a free trade. This is justified. These policies are justified in terms of free trade. Now, as one of the functions of these policies, we see spiraling atavistic rage towards the West. My wife was in Argentina a few weeks ago and walked out of a hotel, and there was a huge anti-American demonstration, huge demonstration. It wasn't reported in the papers here. And the reason that you had that demonstration is that the people of Argentina are enormously embittered toward the International Monetary Fund because it imposed policies in the name of structural adjustment on Argentina that have had devastating economic effects, and the International Monetary Fund is based in the United States. So she saw firsthand this effect. And you've also had, as a result of all this in recent years, some erosion of the optimistic assessments about where these, in other words, a few years ago, globalization is going to make us all rich and happy, and I think some doubts have begun to surface increasingly about that. Now, the World Bank, I want to say a few things particularly about that institution. As I said, was established after World War II in the name of bringing more economic stability to a world that was trying to recover from this devastating war. The problem is that the policies of the World Bank are very much tied to the interest of transnational corporations. The World Bank operates in a profoundly non-democratic manner. By that I mean that they consult top government people, they consult top transnational corporate executives, but they don't consult the people. That's really been one of the problems. I have a book on my shelf, a collection of readings with the term World Bank literature. And the editor of this book argues that there has been for some time the term post-colonial literature, and that term should be replaced with the World Bank literature, the World Bank as a new metaphor for what is really happening in the world, particularly with regard to developing countries. Now, what are some of the policies of the World Bank have terrible consequences. And the way I became aware of this in a very direct way was the following way. My daughter went to Thailand for her junior year. And while she was in Thailand, she came to live among river people, whose simple little river fishermen, whose way of life was destroyed by the policies of the World Bank. She became very actively involved with them. She lived among them. My wife and I told her before she went to Thailand, we said, you know, they don't have a Bill of Rights there. Don't get in trouble. And we got back a copy of the front page of the Bangkok paper, which she had a bandana around her head. She's holding up a sign. She's protesting the policies of the government. Well, we weren't all that happy about that. Now, I'll tell you one other story that we visited her in December of 1999, and she actually came back a little earlier than she planned to in April of 2000 to participate in the protest in Washington, D.C., the anti-globalization protest, to make a presentation about the Pak Mun damn what she had observed there. And I went down to the airport to pick her up. My wife was teaching, couldn't come with me, and I was down JFK Airport. I'm looking for my daughter. This shaved head punk is coming towards me. I'm looking for my daughter. And then I realized that the totally bald punk is smiling and waving at me. And I recognized my daughter. As we're walking to the car, she says, "Dad, you're probably wondering about this." I said, "Well, now that you mention it." And she said, "Well, Dad, about a week and a half ago, I was in Laos. I got a terrible case of lice, Dad. By the time I discovered it, they were building colonies in my hair." Now, in a remote part of Laos, you can't go to the nearest Rite Aid drugstore. She ended up in a little village where an intoxicated woman with a straight razor shaved off all her hair. And I'm thinking as we're getting into the car, gee, I'm going to have to give Jean, my wife, a heads up on this. And as we're getting into the car, she said, "Dad, don't tell Mom. I want to surprise her." Mom was surprised, I can tell you. Okay. Well, in any case, to get back to the World Bank, it is really driven by criminogenic incentive structures. That is to say, those who work for the World Bank, they are rewarded according to getting out grant money and getting the money out, getting the programs out, regardless of the consequences they might have for ordinary people. Now, it is true that the international financial institutions, including the World Bank, are not states, they are not governments, but arguments have been made that nevertheless, as quasi-public institutions, they have fundamental human rights obligations, and by the standards of international law and treaties and a lot of other criteria, which they have in fact not met. So there's a need for more accountability and just alternatives in this case. Now, I made allusion, of course, to famously the Seattle anti-globalization movement. And I dislike that term that is very common, the anti-globalization movement, because it has a completely negative against something, as though those involved just have a kind of a negative program. And I think that's a misconception. And so I agree with those who characterize this movement as a global justice movement, not a anti-globalization movement. But it is made up of diverse constituencies. What they have in common is they oppose corporate globalization. That is to say, globalization driven by the interests of transnational corporations. They're calling for globalization from below. And in a globalized world, they have an increasing capacity to mobilize much more rapidly. Indeed, again, the New York Times famously said not too long ago that while the United States is sometimes said to be the only superpower in the world left today, this anti-globalization movement, as they call it, or the global justice movement, may emerge as a new world superpower. Whether that comes to pass remains to be seen. But one part of that is that it represents an effective social movement. It may represent an effective social movement against at least some forms of white-collar crime. So that is, I think, part of the globalized framework in which white-collar crime has to be understood today. Now, I also said that it has to be understood in the context of increasingly a postmodern society. I want to differentiate between French postmodern thought and the notion that increasingly we have moved to a postmodern society, a distinction between pre-modern, modern, and postmodern societies. It does make sense that we live in a world where there's an emergence, increasingly, of a postmodern society. Obviously, you have the coexistence in our world of traditional elements. In my own state, the Amish, of course, are holding on to a very traditional way of life. You have those people, many people in Detroit and Pittsburgh, who really are still living in the context of a largely modern industrial society, but increasingly you have the significance of postmodern dimensions. Just to go through this very briefly and very quickly, just to outline this, that a pre-modern or traditional society is characterized by an agricultural way of life and hand tools and villages. The family, farm, business is the primary form of organization. Communication is primarily interpersonal. The expectation of stability, both geographic and in terms of occupation, tends to be the norm. And to the extent that something we might call white-collar crime exists in a traditional society, it is primarily local, frauds and certain kinds of local events. Now, the modern world, modern mass society, all of you learned this, of course, in secondary school, is characterized by industrialization, machines, urbanization, bureaucracies, increasingly mass communication, mobility, both geographic and occupational mobility, children much less likely to follow the careers of their parents. And in this context, and this is the context in which Sutherland was writing, white-collar crime is increasingly national. Now, in a postmodern or emerging postmodern society, of course, increasingly computers replace machines as at the center of our technology. Virtual communities become increasingly important relative to traditional urban communities. More fluid and flexible types of organizations, a futurologist has called them adhocracies, emerge. Communication increasingly on the internet and in other